Evagrius Ponticus notes that these ritualists find ways of escaping through excessive hospitality at inappropriate times. In an organizational context, these workers are known as the life of the party. But when it comes to work, they do as little as possible. The third kind of worker that struggles with acedia can be called a hermit. And here the worker has internalized the goals and objectives of the organization, but because of a state of personal acedia or sloth, fails to act on these goals and objectives. Here the worker finds ways to withdraw from the general operations of the organization and can be referred to as one of the invisibles. Evagrius Ponticus notes that these kind of workers often feign illness and are given to providing elaborate excuses for why they are not able to meet the performance standards of the organization. Lastly, let's describe organizational rebels. And here the worker perceives the social and operational structures of the organization itself as the primary barrier to personal success and effectiveness, and thus seeks inwardly to establish a new organization with renewed goals and objectives, but because of personal acedia considers it too much effort. These kind of workers are left in a painful state of constant organizational paralyzing ennui. Nothing is ever right and it takes too much work to try to fix it. Such workers often move from organization to organization, always looking but never finding that perfect company or dream job. The question here is, can organizational leaders rescue the critics, ritualists, hermits, and rebels in their organization? Is there a remedy for this kind of sloth or acedia, this moral not caring that finally kills? The remedy for acedia, according to the earliest monastic leaders that coined the phrase, we're speaking of course of Evagrius Ponticus, John Cassian, and Gregory the Great, lies in the recovery of the virtue of personal and organizational humility. Regan Sutterfield, in contemplating the writings of these early Christian organizational leaders and thinkers on the dangers and remedies of acedia, writes, quotation mark, "The answer to this acedia, I believe, is humility. A lowliness and closeness to the earth, a sense of our limits against what we do not understand or know, our powerlessness against what we cannot ultimately control. But humility also brings with it a better understanding of the simple and good things all around us. It helps us to have a reverence for the life that the ennui of acedia blinds us to." End quotation mark. How does the often neglected virtue of humility helps to combat the paralyzing effects of acedia? The power of organizational humility lies in its power to not only provide an accurate picture of our gifts, abilities, and limitations, but also in its ability to help us learn from one another, thus inoculating us from the isolation of prideful sloth. Humble leaders and workers recognize that they are part of a larger organizational structure and can only fulfill the mission of the organization as they depend on the wisdom, efforts, and goodwill of others. The virtue of humility has not been a central part of recent organizational leadership literature and research. But it seems that the tide started to turn as the century did in favor of a more virtuous approach to leadership, culminating in the publication of Jim Collins's pioneering article on Level 5 leadership in the January 2001 edition of the Harvard Business Review. Collins here proposed that the most powerfully transformative executives surveyed in his study all possess the virtue of personal humility. Although Collins' work does not describe the process of formation of humble leaders, it does provide an erudite fourfold description of organizational leadership humility. Collins proposes, firstly, that personally humble leaders demonstrate a compelling modesty. They shun public adulation and they never boast. Secondly, personally humble leaders act with calm and quiet determination, not relying on inspiring charisma to motivate, but rather inspired standards. Thirdly, personally humble leaders avoid personal ambition in favor of multi-generational organizational growth and development. And lastly, personally humble leaders are self-reflective and tend to appropriate blame towards themselves and not others. Another recent study by Morris, Brotherich, and Urbanski in 2005 on the recovery of humility in the workplace proposed that emphasizing the cultivation of humility in both leaders and followers in organizations would do three things, and that they would positively predict, firstly, supportiveness towards others. Secondly, socialized power motivation. Your workers would be energized to engage with the mission and goals of the organization. And lastly, it would predict positively participative leadership. In addressing acedia, the cultivation of organizational humility would assist the critics to gain a wholesome perspective that it takes the collective knowledge of all the employees to structure the institutionalized practices of the organization. For the ritualist, personal humility would empower them to assess whether they can operate within the mission and stated values of the organization, and if not, provide them with the integrity and dignity of leaving the organization without causing disruption. Cultivating personal humility would allow the hermits to accurately assess their own gifts and limitations, thus freeing them to leave their self-induced isolation and join the rest of their colleagues in the continued efforts to fulfill the mission of the organization. Finally, the virtue of humility would facilitate the transformation of the rebels in an organization by addressing the self-sufficient pride that so often besets those who firmly believe that their perception of reality is the only true perception. But now a larger question arises. How do leaders and followers cultivate humility? It might again not come as much of a surprise to know that Jim Collins is not the first person to describe the possibility and power of organizational humility. A 6th century monastic leader and philosopher, of course we're speaking about the great Saint Benedict of Nursia, struggling with the effects of sloth and acedia in his own organization, wrote a rule in which he provided his followers with a 12-step process description of how humility is formed in leaders and followers alike. Benedict's rule in humility has worked well as a guide and kind of as a spiritual manual, facilitating personal and communal transformation within the Benedictine order and other similar organizations for well over 1,500 years. In adapting Benedict's list to organizational development, Craig and Oliver Galbraith in 2004, a father and son management authoring team, wrote an insightful little book on the organizational principles within the Rule of Benedict entitled The Benedictine Rule of Leadership, Classic Management Secrets that you can use today. Galbraith and Galbraith's translation of these 12 steps towards organizational humility is an excellent guide in the quest to combat acedia and sloth in organizations. I want to quickly take you through these 12 steps. Step 1, revere the simple rules. Humble leaders and followers strive to obey and follow the basic rules of courtesy and the organization. They model good behavior to those around them. Step 2, reject your personal desires. Humble leaders and followers curb their own desires for fame and achievement, ever aware of the possibilities of pride and arrogance. Third step, obey others. Humble leaders and followers readily follow and obey those placed over them in positions of authority. They recognize the wisdom of collective wisdom and service. Step 4, endure affliction. Humble leaders and followers willingly, in the turn of course, the words of Jesus, turn the other cheek in situations of conflict and work towards peace and harmony within the organization. Step 5, confess your weaknesses. Humble leaders and followers are honest and transparent about their own limitations and weaknesses. They communicate these regularly to those that work with them. Step 6, practice contentment. Humble leaders and followers try to be content in their current positions, jobs, and general situations in life. They recognize the value and power of simple contentment and labor. Step 7, learn self-reproach. Humble leaders and followers adopt the disciplines of internal reflection and do not seek to place the blame on others. They readily accept responsibility for both successes and failures. Step 8, obey the common rule. Humble leaders and followers obey all the organizational rules, not just in letter, but also in spirit. Step 9, understand that silence is golden. Humble leaders and followers control their speech and adopt plain and clear avenues of communication. Step 10, meditate on humility. Humble leaders and followers consciously seek to cultivate humility and seek to understand what this means in an organizational setting. Step 11, speak simply. Humble leaders and followers talk in an appropriate tone, in gentleness and with kindness to everyone in the organization. They treat everyone with respect and dignity. And the last step, this of course according to Galbraith and Galbraith's adaptation of Benedict's 12-step program. Step 12, act humble in appearance. Humble leaders and followers act humble in appearance as well as in heart. Cultivating personal and organizational humility remains the best remedy for those that have been plagued by the paralyzing effects of sloth and acedia in organizations. A humble stance towards work and life returns the possibility of having fun while working back to the organization. It brings back life. As the medieval Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas, of course, wrote, "There can be no joy in living without joy in work." Organizations across the world are rediscovering the power and energizing effect of enjoying our work. In a Christian sense, turning our work into worship. Arthur C. Brooks in 2007, in his proposal to rediscover the joy of work, says it best. Start quotation. "In short, most people like their jobs and would work even if they did not have to. Obviously, there's a point beyond which excessive hours of work will lower health and quality of living. But within the bounds of normal work life, the data are overwhelmingly clear that for the vast majority, our work in and of itself gives us happiness." End quotation. Thank you so much for joining us in this, our very first virtual conference on moral leadership. And I hope that this presentation on the paralyzing effects of sloth and acedia in organizations and how the cultivation of humility would help to stem and to resist this noonday devil will help you. God bless you. Thank you.